This video will introduce and explain the 5 main types of arguments. These are factual, definition, cause and effect, evaluation, and proposal. Before we even start looking at those 5 main types, let's pause to consider what really matters most in any argument. When you're making decisions about what topic to write about what kind of claims to include, about how to organize the piece, about which appeals to emphasize. What do you need to be thinking about when making all of those decisions? Hopefully, you said audience. Remember that argument isn't just talking. It's not just words. It has a goal. You have a purpose when you're creating an argument, and that is to create some kind of change. You want to change what the audience thinks, feels, or does. So if you're not changing the audience, you're not making an argument. Keeping this in mind is going to help you understand how some of the types that we're about to cover can actually be arguments. We start with arguments of fact because that's really the place where we encounter disagreement first. If we don't agree about the facts, we can't move forward into anything else. Factual arguments question, well, obviously the facts of the subject. They ask whether or not something is true, whether or not a problem even exists. So some questions that we might ask when entering a factual argument are, did something happen? Did this thing happen? What are the facts? Can we arrive at some kind of verified conclusion about the subject itself? Most of the time when we're making arguments of fact, we're really arguing about the extent to which something is even a problem. So here are a few examples. Is climate change a real problem that we should be worried about? While most scientists say yes, there are some people who don't believe that it is. So we would be having a factual argument with those people or to that audience. To what extent do teenagers suffer from mental illnesses? Is another question that if you have an audience that doesn't believe it's enough of a problem to do something about it, then you have an argument of fact that you need to make. Another question, is racism still a problem today? There are some people who would say, definitely not. Racism, we covered that, like we're good. But unfortunately, there's a lot of evidence that shows it still is. So with arguments of fact, once you start thinking about the people you might argue to, it starts to become easier to understand how facts can become arguments. Notice the keywords and patterns here. Factual arguments usually ask yes or no questions and to what extent questions. It is not, in spite of the fact that, we can imagine quite a few different types of factual arguments, it's somewhat rare that the entire argument is going to be an argument of fact. Usually what happens with factual arguments is that it's a small piece of a larger argument that is dominated by one of the other types. Because usually the facts we have to establish early in a piece, and once we've done that, we can move on to one of the other types. So, example is that if we're trying to make an argument about increasing funding for mental health training in schools. Let's say we want the superintendent or the Board of Education to invest in more school psychologists. We would need to make a factual argument early in the piece that shows there's a real problem in our school. with mental health. And then we would move on to talking about what we're proposing, why that would be feasible, etc. Another example I have here, if I want to create a cause and effect argument about the dangers of e-cigarettes, I would first have to prove that a significant number of people actually use them. Otherwise, the argument becomes moot. It's not a meaningful argument. There's really no exigence for it. Definition arguments try to establish whether or not something belongs to a certain category, or they really just try to define terms that might be controversial terms. So here are a few examples. What is marriage? Again, this was not an arguable term for a long time. And then when people started fighting for gay marriage rights, then that became a really important word, and how we defined that word had great significance for a lot of people. What is climate change? Defining this term and setting the parameters around it is going to help us make arguments about whether or not this is something that we really need to do something about. Some people would argue, and this kind of gets into causes, but some people might argue that climate change is really just part of the natural occurrence, so that climate change is something natural. And if you wanted to make an argument that climate change, in fact, has more to do with the catastrophic, smaller disasters that we're seeing, then you could make that argument. 3, can dependence on a smartphone be classified as an addiction? So we would need to define what addiction is. And then we would look at how using a smartphone too much fits that criteria. And finally, what is creativity? So any arguments about creativity, an argument that wants to say that we need more creativity in schools, while your entire piece might not be about creativity, you're going to need to establish or define what creativity is in order to make that larger argument. Notice the keywords and patterns here. Definition arguments often ask, what is blank? Similar to factual arguments, definition arguments are rarely the umbrella or dominant type of an argument. It's much more common to incorporate definitions into a different type of argument. And this needs to be done anytime you anticipate that the audience might not agree with how you're defining terms that are important to your larger argument. Here's an example. If you're making an argument about preserving privacy rights, you will likely have to establish and prove that your definition of privacy is a valid one. Do not assume that your audience will automatically agree with the definition that you have come up with. If there's any doubt, then spend a little time defining the term and establishing this as your working definition in order to at least have the audience understand what you mean by the term as they read the rest of your argument. Cause and effect arguments ask questions about the causes and effects of the subject. And we can really approach it from a few different angles. We might look at, here's a problem. Let's investigate what caused it. We might want to do this because in order to solve the problem, we need to understand what caused it. Climate change is a good example here. We have to understand what's causing the problem. If it's being caused by human behavior, then solutions are going to involve changing those behaviors or mitigating the effects of those behaviors. If it is just part of the natural Earth cycle, then there's much less, maybe nothing, that we can do about it. Why do students cheat? Looking at the causes of that behavior is going to help lead to more effective solutions. Cause and effect arguments also ask about the effects of a proposed change solution. So if here's something that is happening, let's look at how it might impact us down the road. So an example is, what are the effects of social media on adolescent mental health? Social media is here, it's probably not going anywhere. But if we start to closely examine some of the effects, then we might be able to come up with ways to help reduce the damage for any possible negative effects. Cause and effect arguments are fairly common as the umbrella type of arguments. We often have to weave the other aspects in. We might have a factual paragraph, a definition component, and then move into cause and effect as an argument. And maybe it's going to hint at solutions later. But these are the kinds of questions that require a lot of time and space to develop answers to. So you might have an argument that is primarily cause and effect. The keywords and patterns for cause and effect arguments are questions that ask why, or use cause and effect terms like cause, effect, because, etc. Evaluation arguments raise questions about the quality or fairness of the subject. What is this thing's quality? Is it good or bad, right or wrong, fair or unfair? Is it better or worse than something else? So anything that's really trying to get at, is this good or bad? Is this beneficial or not? So here's a few examples. Would a single-payer healthcare system benefit most Americans? Are standardized tests like the ACT and SAT fair, accurate measures of a student's ability to succeed in college? How effective are current gun control policies in preventing or limiting mass shootings? Notice the keywords or patterns. Evaluation arguments usually include value terms, such as good, bad, effective, ineffective, fair, unfair, beneficial, not beneficial. The word terms that are trying to establish positive or negative are entering evaluation arguments. And the fifth main type of argument is arguments of procedure, which I often call proposal arguments, because you're proposing a change or you're proposing solutions to a problem. So the questions for proposal arguments are: what action should be taken? Who should be involved in helping to solve the problem? How feasible are the solutions? Here are a few examples of the kinds of inquiry questions we might ask for this type of argument. What should we do to mitigate the effects of climate change? How might we make education more meaningful for more students? How might we reduce instances of sexual assault on college campuses? Proposal arguments are often combined with factual arguments. As I said on the factual argument slide a few moments ago, factual arguments tend to be a paragraph or so, making claims, providing evidence that this problem exists, that it's real, that it affects the audience in some important way. And then once you get your audience in a place where they accept here is a real problem, then you can move on to talking about possible solutions and perhaps even arguing here is what should be done and here's why this is a good solution. The keywords and patterns here are how questions and future-oriented verbs like should, might, and will. Most often, the various types of arguments work together. If you want to propose reforms to affirmative action, you first have to evaluate the current policies to show they're ineffective. If you want to show the harmful effects of not having enough women working in STEM fields, then you will first need to make a factual argument proving that women are in fact underrepresented in these careers. For more information on each type of argument and how identifying each type can help you structure and organize a complex argument, please watch the additional videos about each specific argument type.